All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We're diving into something super practical today. How to give your own personal information in Spanish. We're using Unidad 1A from Deep Dive Spanish with Javi Correa as our guide, specifically episode 5, part 1.
Pedir datos personales part 1.
Yeah, which focuses on asking for personal data. But today we're flipping it and putting you, the listener, in the driver's seat. We're going to equip you with the Spanish you need to talk about yourself with confidence.
It's amazing how much you can communicate in a new language just by mastering these basic building blocks, and Javi Correa's material is a great place to start. By the end of this deep dive, you'll be surprised how much you can already say in Spanish.
So let's jump right in. The very first thing you'll probably be asked when you meet someone new is your name. In Spanish, the question is, ¿Cómo te llamas?
Which, if you translate it directly, it's more like, how do you call yourself?
Yeah, it sounds a little strange in English, but it really just means, what's your name? And the answer is super simple. Me llamo, plus your name. So let's say your name is Sophie. You would say, Me llamo Sophie.
That phrase, me llamo, is key.
Right. It means, my name is Hirasser. The source mentions the verb llamas. And you might notice that me at the beginning, which connects to the idea of calling yourself. But honestly, for now, just focus on me llamo and you'll be golden.
Exactly. Get that phrase down and you're already off to a great start. And that me, it actually shows that the action of calling is pointing back to the subject, which is you. It's like a shortcut for saying, I call myself.
Right. So after you've introduced yourself with your first name, what comes next? Well, usually it's your last name. In Spanish, the question is, ¿Cómo te apellidas?
Again, similar structure to the first name question.
Definitely. It literally means, how are you surnamed? And the answer follows that same easy pattern. Mi apellido plus your last name. So if your last name is Garcia, you'd say mi apellido Garcia.
That me apellido is the essential phrase here, meaning my last name is. And just like before, the source mentions the full verb apellidarse, but you can absolutely get by with just knowing mi apellido.
These parallels are so helpful for learning, right?
Absolutely. When you see how ¿Cómo te llamas? And me llamo connect to ¿Cómo te apellidas? And mi apellido, it really makes it easier to remember. It's like a pattern you can use to decode the language.
So now you've shared your name. What's next? Often people will ask about your origins. The question for that is, ¿De dónde eres? That translates directly to, where are you from? And this is where things get a little flexible, which is cool. You've got two main ways to answer this. You can say soy plus de plus the country. Like if you're from Ireland, you'd say soy de Irlanda.
And it's de in there, not del or anything else, just de plus the country.
Right. Or you can use your nationality directly. Soy plus the nationality. So if you're Irish, you could also say soy irlandés or soy irlandesa, depending on your gender. The key word in both answers is soy, which means I am. And the source points out that ser, which is where we get soy from, is an irregular verb that means to be.
And it's a verb you use for characteristics that are part of your identity.
Exactly. Like where you're from, your nationality, those are things that are core to who you are. So you use ser.
Okay, so now you can tell someone your name and where you're from. But what about what you do?
Your profession, right.
Exactly. There are two common ways to ask about your profession in Spanish. You might hear ¿A qué te dedicas?, which is like saying what do you dedicate yourself to, or what do you do for a living? And then there's a slightly more direct one, ¿De qué trabajas?,
which basically means what do you work as? Right. And for both of these questions, you've got a couple of good options for answering. You can keep it simple and say soy plus your profession. For example, soy ingeniero, meaning I'm an engineer. Or you can use the verb trabajar, which means to work, and say trabajo de plus your profession. So trabajo de ingeniero would be I work as an engineer. And of course, a super useful phrase to know is soy estudiante, if you're currently a student.
Yeah, that one's a must-know if it applies to you. And, the fact that you have these two main ways to talk about your profession gives you some nice variety in your conversations. Soy plus your profession is often shorter and snappier, while trabajo de plus your profession can sometimes sound a bit more descriptive. And you mentioned trabajar. That's actually a regular R verb. Remember that R ending? It'll come in handy later when we talk more about verb conjugations.
So we've covered name, where you're from, and what you do. What's next? How about age? The question for that is, ¿Cuántos años tienes? That translates pretty literally to how many years do you have? And to answer, you say tengo plus the number of years plus años. So if you are, let's say, 25 years old, you would say tengo 25 años. The key word here is tengo, which means I have.
And the source mentions that tener, the verb meaning to have, is an irregular verb in Spanish.
Right, so it doesn't follow all the typical rules. But, even though in English we say, how old are you? And in Spanish, you have years.
It's just one of those differences between the languages, but once you get used to it, it becomes second nature.
So we've done name, origin, profession, age. Now let's talk about where you live. The question is, ¿dónde vives? Simple to the point. Where do you live? Where do you live?
Yeah.
And you answer with vivo en plus the place. So if you live in Berlin, you'd say vivo en Berlin.
That word vivo means I live.
And the source tells us that viver, meaning to live, is a regular ear verb. Notice that different ending there compared to trabajar.
Just keep in mind for now that vivir ends in ir.
And finally, let's talk about where you work. The question you might hear is, ¿dónde te trabajas? Which is simply, where do you work? And the answer follows the same structure as ¿dónde vives? Trabajo en plus the place. For instance, you could say, trabajo en un hospital, meaning I work in a hospital. Or, like the source gives us an example, trabajo en una escuela, I work at a school. The important word here is trabajo, which means I work. And as we mentioned earlier, trabajar is a regular R verb.
So
Awesome. Okay, so we've covered, a lot of essential questions and answers here
a lot of good stuff.
for sharing your personal information. And as we've been going through these, you may have noticed that a lot of these verbs,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about yourself, they end in O.
Right.
Our source material, Deep Dive Spanish, has a really helpful grammar tip that actually explains why that is.
They do. It's really well explained, too.
Yeah.
And what I like about it is that it breaks down the 3 types of Spanish infinitives.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, infinitives are the verbs in their basic form, like to work, to read, to live.
Yeah.
And in Spanish, those verbs end in ar, or er.
Right.
So you have trabajar, leer, vivir. And then the source focuses on how these verbs change when you are the one doing the action.
Exactly. And they point out that for the first person singular, which is yo, meaning I, regular verbs typically end in that O. So yo trabajo means I work. Yo vivo means I live.
Exactly.
And we've been seeing this pattern a lot, right?
We have.
So me llamo from llamarse. Me apellido from apellidarse. Soy, which is, although it's irregular,
Right.
it still follows that pattern. Tengo from tener, which is also irregular, but still follows the pattern. Vivo from vivir. Trabajo from trabajar.
Yeah. It's cool to see it
Yeah.
all laid out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the source goes on to explain the second person singular,
Right.
which is tu.
Which is the informal you.
Yeah, the informal you.
Yeah.
And regular verbs in this case
Yeah.
often end in S.
Right. And think back to all of those questions we were looking at.
Yes.
Right. So, ¿cómo te llamas? That S on llamas
Exact.
corresponds to tu. Exactly.
And again, ¿cómo te apellidas? Same thing.
Same thing.
De dónde eres? Even though ser is irregular,
Right.
it also has that S ending
Right.
for tu, right? And then all of the other ones as well,
All of them.
right? ¿A qué te dedicas?
Yep.
¿De qué trabajas?
Mm.
¿Cuántos años tienes?
All of them.
¿Dónde vives?
Mm.
¿Dónde trabajas? All of those questions directed at you often use that S ending.
They do.
So that's a really crucial connection to make.
It is.
Right.
And it's a helpful pattern to notice.
Yeah, the question is directed at you too,
Right.
using that S ending, and then your answer when you're talking about yourself, yo,
Right.
will often use that O ending,
Right.
especially with regular verbs.
Especially with those regular verbs.
Right.
It's a good thing to notice.
Okay, and then finally the source mentions the third person singular.
Right.
El, or ella, meaning he or she,
Exactly.
which typically doesn't have that S
Doesn't.
ending, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, el trabaja means he works.
He works. Exactly.
And this is going to be super important
He will.
in the next part of this
100%.
miniseries, so stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned.
But for now, this was a really helpful, I think,
Yeah.
overview.
It's a good kind of foundation.
Yeah, just seeing those patterns
Yeah.
can take you beyond just memorizing phrases, right?
I think so.
And actually understanding how the language works.
Absolutely. And I think if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
understanding these basic conjugations really empowers you to start constructing your own responses and adapting to slightly different questions,
Totally. Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
let's circle back
Sure.
to why this information is so valuable for you as a listener.
Okay.
So the host of Deep Dive Spanish mentions that this is just the first part of their mini-series on personal data.
It is.
And in their next episode,
Yeah.
episode 6,
They're going to be focusing on how to ask for and give someone else's personal data.
which I think is a cool kind of continuation of this.
Yeah.
Right? Because now we know how to talk about ourselves.
Yeah.
But what about other people?
Exactly. And this is where
Mhm.
those third-person conjugations that we just talked about
Exactly.
are going to come into play.
Like el trabaja.
Exactly.
Right.
So if you found this deep dive helpful
Yeah.
for talking about yourself,
Hmm.
definitely tune in to the next one to learn how to ask about other people.
For sure.
But even with just these phrases that we've learned today,
Yeah.
think about all
Yeah.
the possibilities, right? You can introduce yourself,
Yes.
talk about where you're from, what you do. These are really the building blocks
Yeah.
for so many
Right.
initial interactions.
And I think it raises a good question for the listener. Now that you're equipped with these basic phrases
Yeah.
for sharing your own information.
Yeah. How does that change how you might approach just a simple conversation in Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
You know, can
Yeah.
you imagine scenarios where you might use this right away?
Right. And your mission now, listener, is to really engage with this material.
Yeah.
Right? Don't just let it go in one ear and out the other.
Don't just listen to us.
Yeah.
Actually do something.
Yeah, repeat the phrases out loud.
Yeah.
Write them down. Imagine yourself in a situation where you're using them.
Yeah, even just saying them to yourself can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
And how well you remember them.
Yeah.
And how comfortable you feel using them.
Exactly. The more actively you practice, the more natural these phrases will become.
Absolutely.
So think about,
Yeah.
a future trip.
A virtual meeting.
Yeah.
Even just the possibility of connecting with someone who speaks Spanish.
Right.
Visualize yourself confidently
Yeah.
sharing this basic information.
So for our final thought, to really get you thinking, consider how mastering these seemingly simple ways of sharing personal information
Yeah.
is actually the first step
It is.
towards building real connections
Mm-hmm.
and having more meaningful conversations in Spanish.
Absolutely.
So what other fundamental questions or topics would you be excited to tackle next
Yeah.
to expand your ability
What would you want to learn?
to connect with Spanish speakers,
Yeah.
right? What basic interactions feel like the next logical step
Yeah.
for you in your learning journey?
That's a great point to ponder. I mean, this isn't just about
Yeah.
reciting phrases. It's about
Right.
getting the confidence to engage
Yeah,
and build bridges through language.
absolutely. And I think
Yeah,
these basics that we've looked at today really are that foundation
they are.
upon which
Mhm.
more complex communication is built.
For sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive into the basics of sharing personal information in Spanish with us.
Yeah, it's been fun.
We hope you feel more equipped
Mm-hmm.
and ready to start using these phrases.
Get out there and practice.
Hasta la próxima.